Welcome to part 2 of Publication Ethics on Authorship. My name is Dr. Sharon Pierson, and I am on the faculty of the University of Texas, El Paso in the School of Nursing, and I'm also the editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Nurse Practitioners and nurse author and editor. This is part 2 of a 5-part series, and for this module we're going to discuss authorship, including some of the problems with authorship, like guest or ghost authorship, and describing who qualifies to be an author. We also want to talk about contributorship, and we also want everyone to develop a personal strategy to avoid conflicts in determining authorship. This is an area that's sometimes very difficult in academia if you're dealing with multiple authors on a manuscript or with a research project. So first, let's talk about who is an author. You can find guidelines for this at the International Council of Medical Journal Editors, which is icmje.org. And there is something called the Uniform Requirements for Manuscripts. And the guidelines in this document say that authors must have made substantive intellectual contribution to the work, and also must be able to take responsibility for at least one portion of the work, and also be able to defend the entire work publicly. And the guidelines further say that an author only qualifies as an author if all 3 of those points apply. So who is not an author then? For example, someone who has collected data, including a research assistant who has perhaps collected the articles from the library and done the literature search, or the project supervisor, the thesis advisor. If there has not been substantive intellectual contribution to the work, the manuscript itself, and the development of the project, then that person does not qualify as an author. And I'm going to illustrate a couple of these things with some case scenarios that I've encountered or that have been reported to the COPE Council. And this is one of the cases that occurred in the journal that I edit, which is JAANP. We had an author, Dr. A, who was the contact and the primary author, who submitted a review article on behalf of himself and 2 others, Dr. B and Dr. C. The submission was very well done. It was complete. Everything followed the author guidelines completely. When I submitted it to Authenticate, which is our plagiarism detection software, it came back with an 88% similarity index. So I rejected the manuscript because 88%, and I'll show you an example of this in just a minute, without quoting, without proper quotes, and there's no reason to be quoting that much material in a review manuscript. Review manuscripts sometimes do have a higher similarity index because they're reporting on a number of studies that have been conducted, but to have 88% is really, that was really excessive. So I rejected that manuscript without review and notified all the authors. The second and third authors admitted that they had signed on as authors. They agreed to have their names added to the manuscript, but they did not really do anything. They did not really participate in the writing of the manuscript. It was all the first author. So the question is, what are the ethical violations in this case? Well, besides the fact that there was plagiarism that occurred here, the authorship issue is another one. Why would 2 people sign on as authors when they did not do any of the writing? And I have presented this case a number of times to academic circles, and people tell me that many times they sign on to student papers because they have participated with the student in the work, but they have not really thoroughly vetted the writing of the student, and many times faculty have decided that this is no longer appropriate for them to do, because unless they're sure that the student is not plagiarizing, they do not want their names associated with something like this. So there are some serious issues with people who are students, authors. This was not a student, actually, this case. But there are serious issues when people cannot summarize and synthesize literature, paraphrase it appropriately, so that it does not come out as plagiarized material. So let me just review again what authorship credit should be based on: a substantial contribution to the work. These two authors that we just discussed did not contribute to it. They just agreed to have their names added. They should be participating in the drafting of the article or revising it critically for important content, and also final approval of the version to be published. I don't know whether these authors had final approval on the manuscript, or whether the person involved just said, hey, I'm writing an article, can I put your name on as an author? It'll give you a publication. And for some people that's quite tempting. Oh yeah, publication, I need that for my promotion, I need that for a raise at work. There are a number of reasons why people need to get published. So if you do not meet those criteria, you are not an author. And if you misrepresent yourself as an author, this is a form of research misconduct. And the Office of Research Integrity includes plagiarism and author misconduct in this arena as one of the instances that they will investigate. So let's talk a little bit about guest or gift authors. This may be a culture in the environment where you work. It may be a habit that always the boss gets put on as the last author, or always the research assistant who does the work in the lab of measuring out whatever's being measured gets put on as an author, even though all they are doing is technical work in the laboratory. Now, technical work in the laboratory may qualify as an author if the person has participated in the actual writing of the technical discussion related to the tasks involved. But just doing some laboratory analysis does not qualify a person as an author. The most common situation for this is a junior author who wants to put a senior author on the manuscript to enhance the credibility of the article, so an authority in the field. This happens also with drug and device manufacturers. They look for what they call key opinion leaders in the industry, whose names that they can put on as the first author on a manuscript, even though that person has not done any of the writing. And this is really not not an acceptable practice. So the rewards for this may be financial, or they may be academic advancement, but I've also heard some people say that, well, now that they've come into an administrative position, they don't have time to do their own writing, so they want their name on all the manuscripts that go out of their office. And that's really not appropriate. That is not acceptable for publishing standards. So, and I know it's difficult sometimes for junior authors and for students, doctoral students, postdocs, people who are doing some of this work and having to argue with their supervisors about whether it's appropriate for authorship. This is a very difficult and sticky situation, and you need to find somebody, if this is happening to you, you need to find somebody that you can talk to about it, because it won't be resolved if you ignore it. So I want to present another case, and this is happened in many iterations, many different variations of this sort of situation, but this is a COPE case, and you can find this on the COPE website, which is that publicationethics.org website. A professor submitted a paper to a journal and included his student as an author. And the reason the student was included because the student had drawn 2 figures for the paper. This was not the student's research, it was the professor's research. But the professor was generously offering the student the opportunity to be an author. The paper was returned to the professor for substantial revisions. And the professor did revise it, and somehow in between the original submission and the revisions, decided perhaps the student did not qualify to be an author, and removed the student as an author, but put her in a contribution, in an acknowledgement for her contribution in the drawing of the figures. So the student complained to the editor of the journal about being reduced in status from an author on the first paper to an acknowledged for her work on the figures in the revised paper. And the case was brought to COPE asking, does the student qualify as an author? Because the editor was really not completely clear about this. And the decision of the COPE Council was that the student did not qualify as an author. The student should never have been an author on the first paper, should have been included only in the acknowledgement to begin with. And unfortunately, this was a difficult lesson for the professor to learn, the student to learn, and the editor to learn in this case. So these details about authorship really need to be clarified very early on. So what this student was what ICMJE would call a contributor. So contributors are listed in the acknowledgements. This happens a lot when you have multi-site research studies in different countries. You have large groups of people helping with data collection, recruiting subjects, or there may be writing assistants. In multi-center trials, normally what happens is that the authors of the paper are named up front and everybody else is listed in the contributions. And sometimes for some of these very large multi-center trials, you'll see almost a whole page in a journal of contributors. So contributors should be acknowledged appropriately, but they should also give their permission to be acknowledged. And changing a person from an author to a contributor without discussing with the person is probably going to raise some issues. Ghost authors are unidentified writers who make a substantial contribution to the literature. Now, the ghostwriting problem has been investigated in the past several years. It was heavily practiced in the pharmaceutical industry. Some of these large trials that were done to test new drugs, they were sponsored by drug companies, and many times there was a team of writers or people working on what they call publication management. So out of a large multi-center trial, companies would plan to get several manuscripts published and published as widely as possible. And many times in order to do that, professional writers were employed. Now the professional writers, professional writers are appropriate many times in situations where there are large multi-center trials, especially when there are multiple languages involved, where there's a large amount of data that needs to be sorted and analyzed. So the professional writers do have a role in this, and there are guidelines for who qualifies or who should be a professional writer and how you should acknowledge them. But they always must be acknowledged as well as the funding source. Now, the funding source is probably going to be a large drug company or a large device manufacturer. But sometimes a student might write a paper for an academic, and the academic might, this has happened many times in the past, probably still goes on, but it's not talked about very much. So students who do not get credit for what is submitted by their professors, they are basically ghostwriters, and this is really ethically unacceptable, and it's expressly prohibited by publishers. So this practice really needs to stop. And there are ways now with the electronic documents that we receive when everything is submitted electronically. There are ways sometimes that we can track who is actually writing the paper. And that's how I've caught a number of people at this, and it's a serious problem. But more to the individual authors now in academia, or people who are working on a clinical problem and they're going to write a paper about it, is the order of authorship. That's more relevant to you as an author in a smaller setting. First of all, on the right-hand side of the slide, on the right-hand side of the slide here, you'll see the order of authorship is not the editor's decision. It has to be very clear when you submit the manuscript what order you want these authors in. It has to be clearly labeled, number 1, number 2, number 3, however many there are. It should be, as an author, as one of the potential authors, you should establish it early in the process. Somebody says, oh, let's write an article about that. And one of the first things you should do is say, okay, let's sit down and outline what we want to do, and let's decide who's going to do what, and how we're going to divide up the work, and how the credit is going to be allocated in the authorship. You should make a written agreement, and your authorship order should be based on the contribution to the work. You really need to resist attempts of others to be guest authors. There are some times when alphabetical listing of authors is appropriate. For example, I've learned going to some of the COPE meetings that in mathematics, for the most part, authors are listed alphabetically. So if your name begins with A or B, you're likely to be at the top of the author list on a math paper. And many times there could be 10, 15, 20 authors on a math paper in a math journal. Now that's not the same for the biosciences, and that's probably most of you who are watching this, that's probably the field that you're in. But it can be appropriate if there was an equal contribution of all of the participants to put authors in alphabetical order. How do you delineate contributions? It's basically like splitting up the pie. It's not an exact science. You might try listing all the tasks involved in the research and the paper, assigning people, keep records of your discussions, any changes, reassign tasks if people do not complete as promised, and then when you do finally submit the paper, include your list of author contributions in the cover letter when you submit. Many journals require that now, some do not. But you could say, for example, conceived the design of the research study and participated in drafting the first draft of the manuscript. First, another author conducted all the patient interviews and participated in the analysis of the interviews. Any way you see is appropriate. There is no exact science to this, as I said. So you've just basically got to decide what's fair among yourselves, and then stick with it, unless it's appropriate to make changes because people have fallen through and not done what they said. Now, there have been cases where people have been removed from the author list because they were not there when the paper was submitted. They had participated in the research and the writing, but by the time the article was submitted and approved, that person had moved on, had gone on leave, had been in the hospital for surgery, and was removed from the author list. And this is not appropriate. It's not a listing of who's there at the moment. It's a listing of who did the work. And then one other piece about authorship is decide who's going to be the corresponding author. We as editors consider this to be purely a convenience, an administrative task that somebody needs to fulfill. It does not have to be the first author. It doesn't have to be a senior author, but that person is responsible for maintaining contact and communications with the journal and the co-authors. And there are a lot of reasons that we need to contact authors, so make sure it's somebody who's reliable. Excuse me. Sometimes you may want to change authorship, but try and do that among yourselves. These disputes are not popular with editors, and what happens is your manuscript will be held. We are not going to publish any article where there's a dispute in authorship until that dispute is resolved. And all authors must agree to the change. Let me see. What else do you want to say about that? What justifies a change in authorship? Probably the most common reason is when there have been substantial revisions. If a manuscript seems to be of interest, and yet it's not written well. For example, the methodology and the data analysis piece is really not well done. Somebody else who has participated in the project peripherally may become more involved and may actually do enough work to become listed as an author. So if authorship changes occur between the initial submission and the revision, make sure that you explain that all authors agree, and that you delineate the contributions of the newly added author, or state why an author was removed, because your manuscript cannot move forward without authorship disputes completely resolved. And then finally, in summary, ghost, gift, and guest authorships are unethical practices in publishing, and be sure as an author that you can defend this entire work, that you know what it was about, that you participated in it, and that there are no author disputes in the submitted manuscript. Corresponding authors, make sure it's somebody who's reliable, somebody who is not going to be moving around the country. I encounter this a lot with students who have submitted some of their work when they were doctoral students. They have an email address at their university, and then they move across the country. They go somewhere else, and I can't find them. If I cannot find you, at the time your article goes to publication, your article is not going to be printed. And that has happened, believe me. It's quite surprising to me, but it has happened that people have just basically disappeared. I can't find them anywhere, and so they have a manuscript that could potentially be published, or could have been published, and it didn't get published because the corresponding author was not reliable and did not follow through on obligations as a corresponding author.